The wind howled through the skeletal trees, stripping leaves from their last perches as the full moon cast its silver light upon the Montana wilderness. Nestled at the edge of a sprawling forest was a solitary cabin, aged and stoic, its wooden frame groaning faintly against the chill of an impending storm. Inside, Margaret O'Donnell, an old widow of 73 years, sat near her hearth, knitting by the glow of a sputtering fire. Her movements were slow, deliberate, the needles clinking a soft rhythm that seemed to soothe the loneliness that had seeped into the corners of her life. Outside, unseen and unheard, the wilderness stirred. In the weeks leading up to this night, whispers of an unusually bold grizzly had rippled through the small mountain town below. It had raided campsites, overturned trash bins, and clawed its way into locked barns in search of food. Winter was closing in, and the bear, gaunt and desperate, had grown reckless in its search for sustenance. A neighbor, 20 miles down the valley, had found deep gouges in the walls of his shed just days before. The warnings had been clear. Secure your homes, avoid leaving food out, and, for heaven's sake, stay vigilant. Margaret had heard those warnings, but life in the cabin had dulled her sense of urgency. She'd lived here for over 40 years, weathering storms, prowling cougars, and the occasional black bear lumbering through her yard. But tonight, she was alone, as she had been for the past 10 years, since her husband had passed. The forest felt different, its silence more profound, its shadows darker. The first sign came as a faint scratching at the kitchen window. Margaret paused mid-stitch, her heart skipping a beat. The sound was almost imperceptible, like nails lightly raking glass. She peered toward the darkened kitchen but saw nothing. Shaking her head, she dismissed it as her imagination, the product of an overactive mind on a blustering night. But the scratching came again, more deliberate this time. A low growl, guttural and menacing, resonated from the other side of the door. Margaret rose, her joints protesting, and shuffled to the kitchen. Her breath caught as she saw it. Two glowing eyes, amber and feral, peering through the window. The grizzly was massive, its fur matted with mud and pine needles, its snout pressed against the glass, his snout wriggling. For a moment, woman and bear stared at one another, the fragile pain separating two very different worlds. Margaret's instincts kicked in. She fumbled for the flashlight by the sink, hoping to scare it off. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the bear's scarred face. It recoiled, growling, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it turned its attention to the door, sniffing the air with ravenous intent. Margaret realized too late that she'd left a loaf of bread on the counter near the window. The bear's powerful claws raked against the door, each strike sending splinters flying. Margaret's pulse raced as she backed away, her mind scrambling for options. The rifle her late husband had kept for emergencies was in the bedroom, but getting there would mean passing dangerously close to the door. The bear roared, a sound that reverberated through the cabin and shook Margaret to her core. With a deafening crack, the door gave way, and the grizzly surged inside, its massive frame filling the small entryway. Margaret screamed, grabbing a cast-iron skillet from the counter and swinging it with all the strength her frail body could muster. The pan struck the bear's shoulder, but it barely flinched, its focus fixed on the bread. Margaret stumbled backward, her heart pounding as the bear's sheer size and power overwhelmed the small space. The bear's movements were almost mechanical as it tore through the kitchen, knocking over chairs and shattering dishes in its frantic search for food. Margaret tripped over a fallen stool, landing hard on the wooden floor. She gasped, the wind knocked out of her, and struggled to crawl away. But the bear, in its frenzy, was unaware of her presence until her movement caught its eye. With one last scream, the bear offered her a stick to hide under. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The bear's gaze locked onto Margaret, its breath steaming in the frigid air. It lunged, its claws swiping with terrifying precision. Margaret screamed as she felt the weight of the creature bear down on her, the world fading to black as the storm outside reached its crescendo. The next morning, the cabin stood eerily silent, its door hanging askew and the kitchen in ruins. Outside, the snow had begun to fall, blanketing the forest in an icy stillness. Hours passed before a figure emerged from the tree line. It was Margaret's daughter, Elena, a biologist who had come to check on her mother after hearing about the bear sightings. She approached the cabin cautiously, her boots crunching through the fresh snow. She said, "A cocktail didn't sound right to me in the distance." She approached. "Mom?" she called, her voice trembling as she stepped inside. The scene before her was devastating. The overturned furniture, the shattered glass, and the faint streaks of blood told a grim story. But there was no sign of her mother. Only the deep, clawed tracks leading back into the woods. Elena's breath hitched as she followed the tracks, her heart pounding with dread. The trail led her deeper into the forest, where the trees grew dense and the shadows long. She was about to turn back when she heard it. A low, pained growl. Her hand instinctively went to the canister of bear spray on her belt as she moved cautiously toward the sound. There, in a rocky gully, lay the Grizzly. Its massive body was half buried beneath a fallen tree, its legs thrashing weakly as it struggled to free itself. Elena froze, her mind racing. The bear was injured, likely from the storm, and its snarls were laced with desperation. Her mother was gone, she knew that in her bones. But standing before this creature, Elena felt an unexpected surge of emotion. The bear, for all its power and ferocity, was vulnerable, its life hanging by a thread. She should have walked away. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to let nature take its course. But as a biologist, Elena had spent her life studying animals, understanding their behaviors, their needs. And in that moment she saw not a killer, but a creature fighting for survival, just as her mother had. With a deep breath, she made her decision. Elena set to work, using a branch as a lever to shift the weight of the fallen tree. The bear growled, snapping its jaws, but it was too weak to do more than protest. Sweat dripped down Elena's face despite the cold as she heaved with all her strength. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tree shifted and the bear managed to drag itself free. It turned to face her, its amber eyes meeting hers. For a moment, Elena wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But the bear merely stared, its breath labored, before turning and limping away into the forest. She watched it disappear into the shadows, her heart heavy with a mixture of grief and awe. In the weeks that followed, Elena stayed at the cabin, repairing the damage and mourning her mother. She told the authorities about the attack, but she left out the part about freeing the bear. It was a story she kept to herself, a strange, bittersweet memory that seemed too surreal to share. The forest gradually returned to its quiet rhythms, the snow blanketing the scars of that fateful night. But Elena knew that the wilderness was never truly tame, that the line between life and loss was as thin as the pane of glass that had separated her mother from the Grizzly. She carried that lesson with her, a reminder of the fragility of life and the resilience of the creatures who shared this world. She kept one hand on Adam's arm, holding on with one hand, though the fragility of life and the resilience of the creatures who shared this world. And somewhere in the vast, untamed expanse of the Montana wilderness, the grizzly lived on, a shadow in the trees, a force of nature both feared and revered. Elena's nights were long and sleepless in the aftermath. Each creak of the cabin's wooden frame and every howl of the wind brought flashes of that night. The vivid image of her mother's warm eyes and gentle smile haunted her dreams, only to be replaced by the ferocious glare of the grizzly. She found herself wandering the forest more often than not, as though searching for answers among the towering pines. None of them were to be found, until one night she found herself in the cabin. On one such walk, the snow crunching beneath her boots and the air sharp with cold, Elena stumbled upon the gully again. The indentations from the fallen tree had faded, softened by time and snowfall, but the memory surged fresh in her mind. She knelt, running her gloved hand across the ground, as if trying to anchor herself in the earth where so much had changed for her. A rustling in the distance caught her attention. She stood, her body tensing. From the shadowed tree line emerged a figure, broad and deliberate. Her breath caught as the grizzly stepped into the clearing. The bear's movements were slow, its gait uneven, a reminder of the injuries it had sustained. It stopped several yards away, its amber eyes locking onto hers once more. Elena felt no fear this time, only an aching sorrow and a profound respect. The grizzly didn't linger. It sniffed the air, its massive frame swaying slightly before retreating into the trees. Elena watched it go, her chest tightening. There was no doubt in her mind that it had recognized her. Perhaps in some inscrutable way, they were bound together now. Two lives intertwined by tragedy and the fragile thread of mercy. Elena returned to the cabin, her resolve strengthening with each step. She began documenting her experiences, not just as a scientist, but as a daughter, a mourner, and a witness to the delicate balance of nature. Her writings became a tapestry of grief and wonder, weaving together the brutal realities of the wilderness with its unyielding beauty. She wrote of her mother, of her quiet strength and the love that had shaped Elena's own path. She wrote of the bear, of its desperation and the moment she chose to save it, knowing it could never undo the pain it had caused. And she wrote of the forest, its shadows and light, its cruelty and grace, and the way it demanded both respect and humility. Years later, Elena's work would be published, hailed as a poignant exploration of humanity's relationship with the natural world. But for Elena, it was simply a way to keep her mother's spirit alive, to honor the lessons she had learned in the wake of unspeakable loss. And in the Montana wilderness, the grizzly continued its solitary existence, a silent guardian of the woods, its path occasionally crossing with those who dared to venture into its domain. To Elena, it was a reminder that life, for all its pain and unpredictability, was a gift to be cherished, even in the face of the untamed.